We will then move to the last of the research projects that we're presenting today, which is called Greener, Newer Deals. This project is the one, as mentioned in sort of the chat, there's perhaps the most explicitly one that takes the question of political architectures most explicitly as its framework for questioning, and does so through the lens of sort of the question we've been asking really throughout a lot of the program is, what is the role of the plan? We have the last generation or so of neoliberal economics has told us that decentralized emergence in the absence of central planning is the path that must be followed. There's obviously been a lot of renewed interest in the role of central planning. Part of the questions I think that we've been asked is also trying to understand and evaluate the conditions by which planning not only is returning, but needs to return, but also thinking about not just central planning, but also decentralized planning as a basis by which we can, in fact, act deliberately upon our circumstances and our conditions. As many have said already, it's impossible really for any, I think, seriously to not see the parallels between the inadequate governing responses, not just by governments, but governing responses to both the coronavirus and to climate change. That is, where in the position where something like planetary scale planning and governance should reside, we hear instead a screeching void. Encroaching on the edges of that void are various national and regional Green New Deals, all of which I think quite interestingly imply a kind of fundamental shift in the role of governance and what governance should do. That is, instead of inflecting and what the sovereignty of that governance is, that is, instead of just reflecting the general will of a particularly circumscribed population, governance is now implied also to be the direct management of ecosystems, which are inclusive of that human society, not outside of it in some kind of reified nature. But however, I think as we may see, this doesn't go nearly far enough, even ambitious as they are. This is because really it's the absence, this longer-term absence of strong planning has long discouraged investments in infrastructures that are predicated on the long-term recuperative cycles of energy and material flows that the climate interventions we're describing would necessitate. So something like a more planetary scale Green New Deal, to make sort of an awkwardly but directly phrased point, would also be based then, I think, on that obviously painful link between what we see in relation to the pandemic crisis, a robust public health systems and the economic and ecological viability of the systems that that health system would attend to. It would as well forego, we think, the nationalism that has been the ordinating framework for most of the Green New Deals, at least to a greater or lesser degree, on behalf of more coordination. It would foreground investment in core research and would ultimately, in many ways, de-link some of the culture war romanticisms from the necessities of an ecosystem administration. And so the final group has researched some of what the current state of this predicament is and what a starting point for an ongoing initiative that will be continuing at least through the three planned years of the Terraforming program for the articulation of something like an alternative of Green New Deal, or things that would need to be included in existing Green New Deals based on the ramifications of our research. And so this is one in particular that we, over the next coming weeks and months and indeed years, we invite the broadest possible inclusion and collaboration in the articulation of that program. And so with that, I will pass it to the Greener, Newer Deals group.
Thank you, Benjamin. Hello, everyone. Thank you for sticking to the end. Also, thank you, Holly, for a great presentation. My name is Anastasia, and I'm from the Green and New Deals group, and I'm joining you today from Moscow.
Hi there, my name's Stuart Turner. I'm in quarantine in Berlin at the moment, or in space.
Hi everyone, I'm Timothy Nosov. I'm currently in Moscow. Thank you everyone for staying until the very end, and we'll look forward to your questions and comments.
Hi, I'm Elena. I'm in Tbilisi, Georgia right now. And
according to the IPCC, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius would require rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. Various new policy packages have been proposed, which envisage transition of society to a net-zero carbon emission economy. In our research, we have looked at 13 such proposals put forward under the title Green New Deal. We looked at these proposals by breaking down and then analyzing their three constituent parts: green, new, and deal. We defined green as seriously attempting to tackle climate change. That means physical end states, and whether mobilization of resources or enforcement of rules are prioritized. None appear to satisfy both criteria. We defined new as restructuring the economy beyond existing modes of capitalism, specifically the economic basis for decarbonization and energy transition, combined with the intended geographical scope. We saw that only one sets out to tackle such economic restructuring at the scale of the planet. We defined deal as the extent to which the proposals have teeth, meaning the level of influence combined with perceived level of popularity, in other words, overall traction. We notice that none of them have such a combination of popular support and institutional force. So in our view, these proposals in many ways do not go far enough. Indeed, analysis of the COVID-19 crisis reveals the many opportunities to take the IPCC's call to action more seriously with more expansive climate policies. This crisis of planetary biochemistry, just like climate change, does not respect national borders. Coordination of responses is required on a planetary scale. Both crises relate to an invisible threat with delayed effects, and lockdowns mean stopping most societal functioning, mainly to protect older people. Reacting now to a future threat and adopting intergenerational solidarity are vital. Neoliberalism and right-wing populism have left societies worldwide unprepared for large-scale crisis, and so cannot be a rational basis for responses. Indeed, many governmental reactions to the pandemic have instead favored massive economic stimulus and centralized government control. New ideological foundations are needed. COVID-19 is not the great leveler. Those already subject to inequality and oppression are more at risk. This is not new, but again, it has a parallel in the unevenly distributed effects of climate change. The governments handling the pandemic most effectively have acted by gathering statistical information and applying epidemiological models to plan for possible scenarios. Sensing and modeling are essential to good governance and planning. The pandemic should not have taken us by surprise. There were warnings that pandemics needed to be prepared for. Instead of reacting too late, we should have made significant changes based on what we knew. Transformation, not adaptation. Bearing these lessons in mind, while we don't have a comprehensive solution, we do propose that any Green New Deal should be based on the following principles. Focusing on adaptation means hiding from the necessary consequences of climate change itself. We can influence, and therefore must influence, climate conditions, but that needs to be an intentional, coordinated plan. That needs to be planetary, not at the national level, and that involves seeing climate change as not just primarily an energy planning question, but in fact a spatial planning question, including rethinking the organizational logic of societies and their enclosing ecologies. When considering who are the parties to a deal and who would maintain it, Intergenerational equity demands not just staying home during a pandemic, but extending notions of time deep into the future to consider the effects of planning on future generations and future planetary metabolisms. Governance based on sensing and modeling needs to be extended to a new sensing layer, an automated feedback loop that models and measures the impact of all forms of ecosystem management as the basis for designing our further interventions. Centralized economic planning is the basic operational reality of dominant platform behemoths like Amazon and Alibaba. Such exceptionally efficient systems can be redeployed at an even greater scale so that the cost of goods and services more accurately reflect the true ecological and human impact. Given that most 1.5 degrees Celsius pathways are heavily reliant on the removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, significant investment into carbon capture methods will be necessary. Existing extractive infrastructure should be repurposed to implement such programs. All of these principles imply going beyond a deal or an international treaty as such. Coordinated, planetary scale, deep time planning for transformative change is not just about what governance needs to do, but what governance is. Therefore, any Green New Deal must in fact be an institution, and our project becomes one of an institutional design.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, guys. So we have then time for the a bit of this question session discussion here as well. I've been asked to get this started by posing a question to Holly Jean-Luc, which I'm very happy to do. And then we can go from there before the final words of wrap up. And the question or invitation for comment perhaps to Holly would have to do really with this question of governing and governance issue. The line that you end your presentation with, that there's deep time planning, not just something that governance does, but in fact what governance is or what governments would become in this is apt. But I guess the question that's is that, of course, one of the most intractable and legitimate controversies around the portfolio of technologies that are understood as geoengineering has to do with the ways in which that they are posed as either as a way of keeping everything, sort of keeping a pathological social economy running with a kind of get out of jail free card. At the same time, as your presentation made quite clear, if it were somehow possible to actually make the investments to build the infrastructure that would actually succeed in the reductions of heat and carbon dioxide and all the rest of it that this would imply, so that the long-term temperature goals have a chance to be met as this is all unfolding in concert with radical decarbonization, so on, both reduction and subtraction at once, that it would take a total it would seem at this point to take a radical and fundamental transformation in our governing architecture to bring about that kind of investment, that kind of deployment. And so in fact, it may be some ways in which we need to be thinking about this relationship between the geopolitical and the geotechnical as one in which the geotechnical deployment may be one of the means by which the geopolitical architecture that we may be interested in would be brought about, in addition to thinking it more because we do the other way around. Regardless, it's a long question, long sort of invitation for comment. Really, it has to do with an invitation to think about this relationship between the planetary scale technical architecture and the planetary scale governing effects that these things imply. So with that, I would ask for you to enter into that comment at any point that seems most appropriate.
Yeah, I think that the social
going outside.
Yeah, left the cave. The social transformation part and the technological capacity in developing it have to take place at the same time, and they inform each other. And one thing I've been researching recently is the ways in which societies decided to clean up waste, both solid and liquid, during the progressive era. And there's a kind of a feedback loop. Historian Joel Tartt talks about this in his work, how people saw the effects of the technology helping to clean up their cities. They believed in the technology, but they also increased their belief that, you know, this should be a municipal public works, that the state had a strong role in organizing it and planning for very expensive capital infrastructure. And it was this dynamic between a social movement that had values about public health, sanitation, protecting people from disease, at the same time, engineers who were interested in developing the technology. And there's this kind of profession of sanitary engineering that blended public health and those kind of values with engineering. And I think that we're not in the progressive era now. Obviously, trust in government, in planning, in institutions is much lower. But maybe with this crisis, we can revisit it and have a waste management of the air the same way we attained waste management of water and solid waste.
Great. I want to also then give a chance, maybe any of the people from our the researchers from the groups, to, while we have you online, if there's any dialogue that would make sense to for them to speak through the research that they presented in the form of some questions for this group. If not, we can move to some of the questions that have been posed by the people online.
I would love to ask a question to Holly, if it's possible. In reframing kind of geoengineering from, I guess, the field it is scientifically, and starting to imagine it as more everyday practices, I guess we're still really curious, even if you can imagine and design and visualize coordinations between interventions that might seem disconnected, what your imagination, you know, of this during and after would be, of like who might coordinate these or where it might make sense to coordinate these. And this week we heard a little from Stanley Robinson about kind of a military intervention potentially for geoengineering. And I would just love to get your thoughts on kind of the composition or the stitching together of things that are unrelated.
Yeah, it's hard to see where the social infrastructure emerges from. I mean, I think it emerges from conversations like this, which are interdisciplinary, which have to do with, you know, a lot of the work my colleagues are involved in is how do we inform these connections between people working on policy, people working on engineering, people working in the arts. I think everybody's wrestling with the need for that as kind of a ground for that. It has to go beyond discussions, right? It has to go to the next level of planning infrastructure politics. I don't really know. I think that's the work we have ahead of us.
Thank you.
Anyone else from any of these groups wanted to use this time? I'm not going to call on anyone. Jan, speak. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll have a quick question. I think your critique of sort of the flattening of the curve is really apt and really interesting. Because I hadn't really dove into that as deeply as you did, and my only sort of surface level thought on it was that it was an interesting sort of mimetic language that has come out of this, which I'm always quite interested in. I think the term flattening the curve is something that we won't soon forget. And so I was wondering if you have any thoughts on, like, if there is there more danger in these sort of terms catching on as quickly as they do with limitations as you've pointed them out, or is there still sort of a chance to sort of claim them back or use them for good in a way, if that makes sense?
That's a great question, because obviously the curve isn't going away with regards to emissions, right? It's the main way we understand the project. Although I think in the chat, Benjamin brought up the bathtub metaphor, which is one that's been used too, which is also really instructive for understanding the problem. So I think maybe it's not just a...
You want to repeat the bathtub metaphor just for those who didn't see it?
That we need to look at the carbon dioxide isn't just an emissions problem, it's a stock and flow problem. And so even if we slow our rate of putting water into a bathtub, we also need to be draining it, right? I think it's not just a matter of replacing metaphors, but adding to them with lots of other metaphors. And I know that that presents a science communication challenge. And I don't know if there's an easy way through it besides the long work of education.
Hello, maybe to add to that, to ask Holly a bit more about everyday geoengineering. I noticed that there are many methods which relate to sort of soft, passive tools, which are related to biodiversity, ecological connections, corridors, and these are quite soft, and they are really hard to make it qualitative. They are really, quantitative. They are really not falling directly into saying this captures this amount of CO2, this doesn't decrease temperature, because it's a very complex connection. So you bring in biodiversity and the forest grows and the heat becomes more inside of the forest, and there are many, many different connections. Every insect, every animal, they all count, and it's very hard to make it kind of persuasive enough. And also many people who are protecting and lobbying this idea of biodiversity, they don't really operate with numbers precisely. They mostly really speak about this being important, but they're really hard to it's hard for them to prove their point. And many people just get annoyed with them repeating it again and again. We have to take care of biodiversity. So there are many people who just say, it's not interesting to me. And so I was just curious, how would you treat that? Because there are definitely some machinery and really sort of mechanical tools, really industrial things, and this is another very soft but yet very powerful thing, which is really hard to protect in this way, which is hard to count and predict, because it can take different scales. So if you see it as a one park or one forest, it's really nothing. But if you imagine it multiplied a million times, then it's much stronger. So I would really appreciate if you kind of give an idea how to protect this. Thank you.
I think there's two fronts to be working on here. I think in one way, there's an impulse to say we just need to do better modeling that can capture all of these different parameters better. And I actually am optimistic on progress regarding that, because I think there's a lot of scientists that are interested in those kind of questions. And there's really interesting areas like involving microbes, for example. There's a lot of scientists exploring the role of soil microbes, both in carbon, soil carbon, but also in enhanced weathering, for example. So you see these kind of piece by piece adding up to a whole of understanding that might be better. But I also think that that's not the only way to go about thinking about it, because a lot of the rationales for, biodiversity and protecting habitat and whatever don't have to do with climate change or climate crisis. They have to do with, moral arguments, with co-benefits for human communities. So there's a lot of other ways to approach it besides quantifying particular environmental benefits. And I think we need to be moving along all of those at the same time.
It seems there may be also a kind of CP Snow two cultures problem, maybe implicit in the question to a certain extent. And so your call, which is very well received, that the scope and complexity and multiplication of the metaphors that might work, that besides just sort of reductions to the curve, and the inclusion of humanists into these questions that are in ways in which would actually be able to address some of the secondary, tertiary effects of this as well. Again, well received. The other side of this, of course, it maybe speaks a little bit to the some of the resistance to tropes of quantification of things that might smack of a kind of technocratic intervention, mathematical reductivism on the part of the humanities. In other words, one of the I think that makes this particular moment quite clear, one of the ways in which the real takes its revenge, at least on the humanities side of it, is how a kind of underlying reality, which can be understood in quantitative terms and in qualitative terms, makes itself known in ways, again, that resists metaphorical construction, and yet we have to engage on this way as well. And so I just wanted to indicate that I think part of what we've been trying to do with setting up conversations like this and structuring the program is to try to find ways in which the humanities and the philosophy and the design, and particularly philosophically driven design, can enter into different kind of questions with scientists and indeed with sort of quantitative epistemologies more generally. So that's just a long comment. No. So Nicola, did you want to, would you like to sort of tell us a little bit about what's going on in the chat, and then we can go to sort of closing remarks?
Yes, so there's a question from Federico Zorozoa Gonzalez. I'm just gonna read it out loud. Would territories currently recognized as global commons, like Antarctica or international oceans, be more suitable for global agreements that tackle carbon removal rather than focusing on national isolated policies?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I would invite anyone to sort of enter this. We had this presentation just yesterday from Nicolas de Monchaux, who's the new dean of the architecture school at MIT, who was talking about the history of Terra Nullius, the colonial history of Terra Nullius, and the description of places as, in essence, unoccupied or owned by no one. And was walking us through the ways in which this has established some of the foundations for space law today, particularly the Outer Space Treaty and so forth, and the precedents of Terra Nullius, which were in a way not factual to begin with in most cases, has been the basis for this. And part of the complexity here is perhaps in the distinction between territories that are legally thought to be owned by no one versus those that are legally thought to be owned by everyone. And this is where that shift between the conflict or fusion between the Antarctica as a territory that's owned by no one and the sort of premise of a planetary commons, that is that which is owned by everyone, may in fact prove to be a bit decisively different. Nevertheless, I take the gist of the question as one in which the question of jurisdiction, the question of how sovereignty, if we're talking about governance as something in which there's a sovereign position that is able to act back upon and indeed enforce a decision, as was shown in the sort of empty square of the Green New Deal diagram, the one of enforcement, has been one that has been predicated upon an exclusive right to a particular bit of territory. And indeed, what's quite clear both for the pandemic and for ecology is that these artificial encapsulations into these jurisdictions are drastically misaligned to the needs for how it is that some kind of rational response to this common predicaments might be aligned. Much more to say about this relationship of alternative forms of territoriality, its relationship to other forms of jurisdiction, and indeed this is a big part of our research and program. So we hope to show you more of this thinking perhaps as early as June.
And maybe perhaps one last one, which is quite related to this one, from Scott Garlinger around which political actors or agencies could we project to deploy geoengineering measures from, and how will we recast the roles of these actors?
I'll take a quick stab at that, and maybe I'll invite Holly to do so as well. One of the ways in which it's an open question, and it's one that is an absolutely decisive question. We were reading, as I mentioned, Kim Stanley Robinson's next novel, Ministry of the Future, and I don't think I'm giving anything away to say that one of the key plot points of this book is that India decides, after an utterly catastrophic heat wave in which tens of millions of people die, decides to employ a solar radiation geoengineering initiative on its own, and that the formal institutions of the global north are not necessarily thrilled with this idea, but don't necessarily have the legitimacy to intervene around this as well. I think it's an important sort of twist in a relationship to this is that just as there are different populations that are most likely to be those that are suffering the most catastrophic effects of these kinds of transformations. And we may sort of think about geoengineering as something that Dr. Evil, Peter Thiel, or something is going to pull out of their back pocket and sort of employ in this ways as well. This may not be the case, and the response of the global north to an initiative like that is, hold on, we need to have some kind of rigorous planning and understanding of the secondary and tertiary effects of interventions like this. We need to be doing the scientific testing to figure out whether or not this is actually going to work, and that the effects are not going to be suicidal in effect. And indeed, they're right, but indeed, that's in fact in many ways what we should be doing now. And so that hopefully none of this has to be used. I think this is in a way kind of like, in some ways, the goal of these interventions is to, in fact, not have to do a lot of this stuff. But anyway, I would invite Holly to answer this important question as well.
Yeah, I think it's different depending on what technique you're talking about. I think that solar geoengineering would be really difficult to imagine anybody but a coalition of nation states doing it. Not necessarily unanimous agreement, but at least a few that are taking the lead and others that might not be endorsing it, but also wouldn't be stopping them. And the reason I think that is because it's a very long temporal duration, a solar geoengineering program, 150, 200 years probably at minimum. And so only a nation state, I think, would have the legitimacy to do that and pursue it and maintain it. With carbon removal, I think it's different. Obviously, the regional scale is really important here. Not just, I mean, part of that's because of the particular life cycle bounds of some of these technologies, like bioenergy with carbon and capture and storage. Some of it relates to the scale of regional electrical grids. Some of it relates to the scales of waste management in particular areas. So I think that that's a very useful scale there.
Thank you. Are there any, this question around geoengineering and governance is always one that comes up in this as well. Are there, quickly, would be any references that you'd like to suggest to the audience that they may want to look at, if they, other than your own excellent book on this particular topic?
Yeah, this might be technical, but the best thing I've seen recently on carbon removal has been a report that came out of Lawrence Livermore National Labs called Getting to Neutral, something like negative carbon emissions for California. And even though it's just California, it's the first piece of work we've seen that has a detailed geographic analysis of how an entity on the scale of California could achieve negative emissions. So that makes it really unique, really different, I think, than from a lot of the other writing on it, which is much more high level. They really got in the weeds of an actual plan. I mean, speaking of planning, an actual plan of how to do it.
Great, we'll look that up. Thank you very much. All right, thank you, Holly. Thank you very much for sticking with and spending the time with us here today. I'm going to just say, first of all, thanks to those 200 and so hardy souls who've made it with us through this, through the hours of this. The conversation, I think, has been really, really excellent and inspiring to us as well. And it's just inspiring that you would all want to be part of it. We're very glad that we'd be able to share some of our thinking with you all at this time. Invite you very much that what you've seen here today is really some of the research that will be going into the development of our final projects, which again will be showcased in June, and you're all of course invited back for that as well. I'll reiterate that this Revenge of the Real is also part of an open call collaboration with Strelka Mag. The link for you to submit your research projects and so forth is in the chat. If you want to scroll all the way up, just Revenge of the Real Strelka, you will find that open call, as well as the link to the Terraforming book, which is free to download as an EPUB. Let me just then, in a few words of closing, say just one last thing about sort of what the purpose of our program really is. Our program is and remains one, as you've seen, of what we might call speculative urban futures. But I think what makes it quite different is because as much as possible, we try to keep these terms undecided and therefore sort of alive. The speculative, that is, refers not to what is sort of creatively, what is most sort of whimsically creative from a blank page, but rather the way I sort of think about it is the speculative in this design context is what is so functional and necessary, if also equally unlikely, that it makes conventional schemes, however likely that they are to be repeated, seem insane by comparison. It's actually a kind of hyper-functionalism in this specific sense. And that comparison is in fact moves our predicament. Not only is our business as usual psychotic, but that I would say, I think is unfortunately as well, the normal genres of concerned response and critique may be also deeply neurotic, if not also sometimes delusional. As we developed the previous Strelka program, which we called New Normal, the urban in this sense was defined as something, not just something that belongs to planners and developers and architects, but because cities take shape in so many different ways, that cities don't just take shape through the historical layers of collapsed real estate schemes, that the pressing reality of what should force a redefinition of the cities, and indeed what we mean by urban form as such, has been one of the underlying kind of meta questions that has haunted and informed a lot of this work, based on the understanding the cities are never separate from ecologies, that they are ecologies, and indeed must be composed as such. The future has not been canceled was a sort of unofficial motto of that program of the New Normal, and what it meant to say was simply that the self-validating, self-perpetuating collapse scenarios, however enjoyable they may be as genres of self-indulgence, do not plan make. But also that the official definitions of the future, like that's the time when the iPhone 17 will arrive, are not really the future. But the implication of this is that also to sort of flamboyantly cancel those futures, with the implication that the actual future as such has been canceled along with them, is really to give the ontology of marketing cycles far too much weight than they actually deserve. It was also in a way to, given that our program is based in Moscow, as a way to call upon the history and weighting of Russian utopian thought, science fiction, futurism, and so forth, and its secular cosmopolitan space programs, for example, as an inheritance to claim beyond the borders of that one country. However, and this is the crucial point, in that early 20th century, the future was an inspiration to be achieved. Today, the future is not just something to be achieved. The future is something to be prevented. The future must be prevented, might be the slogan of this program, I suppose. But for this, then, speculative thought in its consequentialist mode that I've described, this kind of uncanny pragmatism, is mobilized to this task of preventing one future so that another one might, with luck, come to pass. A future achieved because another was prevented. And so the ongoing invitation for all of you into this conversation is that in this specific sense, our project is then one of prevention, such that that viable planetarity might be realized. And so with that, one last point, speaking of the future and what it promises, I also want to, we'd all would like to wish a happy birthday to some of the participants in the program, all happen to be today or roughly today. So on behalf of all of us, the 600 or so who joined our conversation today at one point or another, we'd like to wish a happy birthday to Chiara, Laura, Eleanor, and Evgenia as well. So thank you all again for sticking with us, for being part of this conversation. you're all invited to come back in June and to be part of this as we continue over the course of over the next 3 years. So my sincere thanks to those 29 hardy souls who decided to join this experiment back in February, not knowing what they were in for. Turned out they're in for quite a bit more than we had promised them, but have managed over the last couple of weeks to not only persevere, but to produce some, I think, extraordinary work in a very short period of time. And so I'm very grateful to you, and I'm also grateful then to all of to Nicola and Lisa and the other the faculty with whom I co-teach this program, and to Olga and Elena and the rest of the Strelka Terraforming staff, and really the whole institute. Again, thank you very much, and to thank you to everyone who stayed on board. So again, we'll see you soon. Thanks.